So welcome everybody to our session on philosophy and privacy, new interfaces. My name is Michael Nagenborg. I'm an assistant professor for philosophy of technology at the University of Twente, and I'm also the managing director of 3TU Ethics, the organization that is sponsoring this panel. So let me briefly introduce you to 3TU Ethics. The logo is gray, which is not a good choice for a color in this particular setting. But so our full name is 3TU Center for Ethics and Technology. We are part of the 3TU Federation, and that is a joint effort of the three technical universities in the Netherlands, that is Eindhoven, Delft, and Twente, to combine forces on particular research subjects. And we formed a center consisting of the three philosophy departments of Twente, Eindhoven, and Delft, which is now 3TU Ethics. So in total, we have now about 60 members, 9 full professors, that's here 22 senior researchers, a couple of PhDs. I'm happy to have 2 of them with me. And we also have around 40 affiliated members that are not directly working in the departments. What we do is a lot of projects related to ethics and technology broadly considered. Of course, this also includes projects on surveillance and privacy sensitive technologies. So please keep in mind, and also I ask the panel to remind me, and sometimes I come across a little bit negative when I talk about the role of ethics in the privacy debate. We actually also have some success stories to tell. And we have also our own PhD program on ethics and technology, and 2 of our speakers are from that program. I have to make the sad announcement that Aimee from Wynsberghe is not with us. She was originally scheduled for this panel, but she has become ill, and Olga was so kind to step in. And I think she will do a great job in presenting her work. So, since I wanted to organize something around ethics and technology, I also thought it should be something meaningful, and therefore I would like to bring the question to the table. Well, what does it mean that we casually refer to privacy as an ethical issue, especially for ethics as an academic discipline? And the background for this question is that there seems to be some mismatch about what ethics is in part of the projects I have been working on, so this now mostly goes back to my experience, and what ethicists think that they are doing in their everyday life or for a job. So when an ethicist joins a project, that is usually how we perceive ourselves. We come in, clarify the concepts, point to the underlying principles, and help to bring in some clarity. This is how we often are perceived as the party poopers, the naysayers, who always point to all the risks and things that might go wrong and things we should not do. And that is odd. If we look at our own discipline, we like to think about things like the good life. We like to discuss what is desirable. We like to think about things we should do, not only things that we should not do. And I think this general mismatch comes from the fact that ethics is used in very different ways. And 2 of the main tensions that I would like to address here are stemming from the fact that on one side we have institutionalized ethics, on the other hand we have ethics as an academic discipline. And when I talk about institutionalized ethics, I'm thinking about bodies like ethical review boards. A classic from the FP7 program, the wonderful brochure, Getting Through Ethical Review. That gives you a clear message about how to deal with ethics. It's something that you need to overcome, something that is a hassle for something that you actually would like to do, and we even provide you with the guidance how to get the clearance to do what you actually would like to do. And then, of course, there are ethical advisory boards, which are also, especially in the context of European research projects, quite odd institutions because they don't come with any research time. It's because they are part of the administrative process. Sometimes you are even denied any payment in order to ensure your independence. I can tell you that my landlord is always very pleased with my answer to, sorry, in order to be an independent member of ethical advisory board, I cannot pay my rent because they couldn't pay me. So the other implication of this is that since you don't have any research time, you either end up with questions that are really easy to answer, no-brainers, so to speak, But when there are a lot of questions that you cannot seriously address, you cannot seriously come up with an answer that is in line with what you should know as an ethicist, because you don't have research time in order to clarify what is really going on here. And on top of that, this gives this general message that ethics is always about saying no, don't, risk, and so on. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to come up with a panel where we present what philosophers are actually doing and to have a discussion upon how to integrate philosophy in a meaningful way in the general privacy discussion, including work done in research and development projects. So this is the basic idea. And now I move over to Pete. Fussey? No, I ruined my part. Yeah. University of Essex, who will help me out here as a chair and co-moderator, and who will introduce to you the members of our panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pete Fussey from the University of Essex. I'm Professor of Sociology there. In essence, this panel's a slightly different format. It's just going to be two speakers with two who are going to speak for 10 minutes each, and then after each paper we're going to have a five-minute discussion, and then we'll also open it up for general commentary and discussion from the floor as well. So just to introduce the first speaker and discussant, the first speaker is Olga Kudina from the University of Twente, and she's a PhD candidate at the philosophy department there, works on a project called Mediated Morality, Google Glass, Sex Selection and the Complex Interactions Between Ethics and Technology. So her research will contribute to conceptualising moral mediation as fostered by mutual shaping of humans and technology. Okay, so, and then shall be followed by Gemma Gaudon-Clavel, who is a policy analyst working on surveillance and social, legal and ethical impacts of technology. She publishes widely in a range of security and surveillance related areas, including mega events, smart cities, privacy and technology. She's a founding partner of Eticas Research and Consulting as well. So over to you.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's also a great honor to present here. And today I want to talk about not just the multiplicity of ethics as a context when we transfer it from field to field, but since it's a CPDP conference, also what privacy means, how multidimensional it is. And for most of us, it doesn't come as a surprise. But I actually want to draw attention to the users, to people who have to use all of these technologies that come out these days. And particularly, I want to discuss two case studies of virtual/augmented reality glasses such as Google Glass and Microsoft HoloLens. Just to give you a brief outline of my talk, I will first just give you a bit of theoretical background on the project, and then just briefly discuss the methods, because it's an explorative study where I try to combine empirical data along with some philosophical considerations. And I will proceed to analyzing the promises, expectations, actual technological capabilities of the two technologies, along with what it boils down to, and analyzing the findings to my empirical data, and providing some brief conclusions. So one of the major theoretical underpinnings of my project is the theory of technological mediation, that basically says that technologies are never in themselves and people are never in themselves independent and autonomous. They're always in combination with the context that is around us. And so it happens, it's also largely technological context. So we are who we are also thanks to technologies that are mediating our existence and mediating our life. So that's technological mediation. But this technological co-constitution or co-shaping of our lives doesn't actually stop at the door of morality. And our norms and values and normative pinpoints and guidelines are also largely co-shaped with what technological options are available to us, and they also somehow influence our decisions, our reflective process, and ultimately how we act in the world. In my work, I tried to look at the two case studies that I will briefly discuss afterwards, but also I was intrigued by the ethnographic concept of Anne-Marie Moll, namely body multiple, which is that she largely speaks about technologies used in a medical hospital, in medical context in hospitals, that a disease is not just one disease and technologies are not just one, a scalpel or something like that, but it's always you defined in a particular socio-material context that is around it, and people look at it differently depending from which perspective they come at it. So I tried to combine this perspective along with technological mediation, and I wanted to use elements of conversation analysis and discursive psychology to study the short discussions under the certain YouTube videos as commentaries. And if you ever used YouTube, you may know that these commentaries can go pretty wild, and people express a lot of emotions and their thoughts and what they think about. And I thought that I didn't want to turn on to the companies, the business discourse towards these technologies, but rather to see how do people perceive them, how they use them, and what are actual problems that they encounter. So now I will briefly try to analyze the two technologies that I chose, namely Google Glass, which I think some of you are familiar or heard a little bit about it. It's the augmented reality glasses proposed by Google a couple of years ago, with a supposed functional of seamless search and updates, recording images and also videos around you, also in a seamless way, sharing that information recorded, and also with immediate cloud storage available from the Google services as well. In terms of privacy, following Google, it's actually putting the user back in control of their technology. So privacy is shaped as a control of information, and they say that as a company they also ensure of all the privacy or data protection safeguards in their technology by the means of its design, but also by adhering to the national legislations. However, when the product was introduced, it was actually largely criticized not just by public at large, but also by the data protection authorities worldwide, saying that it does not meet the privacy criteria and the privacy safeguards defined by either American or the European legislation, and particularly when it was launched in the United Kingdom. The program was wrapped up, the whole Google Glass program was wrapped up just a couple of months after it was introduced, which was 2 years ago in January, saying that it does not adhere to the national legislative norms. And one of those criticism was the lack of awareness that the Google Glass user shows to the public when they're filming or recording the environment around them, that there are just no signs, and it's virtually constant surreptitious surveillance practices all around, because in the case of surveillance cameras or cell phones, at least you see that there is a device, or you know that in a public area there are signs that you're being filmed. But with a glass user, it's supposed to be such a normal technology. It's just glasses, but a bit enhanced glasses, and the ones that can take recordings of you. And while glass was implemented, it also took a lot of different appropriation techniques from the users who favored or so much not favored the implementation of it around them. For instance, certain glass-free zones appeared, and people made a lot of money making the glass-free zones signs in restaurants and movie cinemas, in theaters, and a majority of other public places. But also, for instance, a whole line of a certain glass hole etiquette emerged on how not to be a glass hole in public. Namely, people started creating themselves some sort of etiquette of what is the appropriate use of Google Glass and how not to be what they defined a glass hole. I'll come back to that a bit later. Microsoft came up with a very somewhat similar augmented reality glasses named HoloLens a day after Google wrapped up the Google Glass project. And interestingly enough, while Google Glass was positioned to be where in your daily activities outside in the parks, and hence the whole privacy problems came up, they positioned their device as strictly for indoor use, and largely justifying it by the functionality. Then they promised to deliver a certain layer of holographic 3D images over the physical world of people to be used mainly inside for work or private purposes, with abilities to project and interact with holograms that you can move around with, see, and actually interact with. And also they promised to simulate with those holographic images, holographic layout, certain physical surfaces. So for instance, they positioned it as a really nice research technology for NASA and other institutions that could simulate a space of Mars, for instance, just without leaving a room. So again, a lot of attention was put on positioning it as a strictly indoor device, and by that they also really decreased kind of the level of privacy concerns to it, because, well, no one is surveilling anyone and no one is taking recordings of you. However, are there really not any privacy concerns? They, by policy-wise, Microsoft uses privacy by design as their original principle, and also the kind of the slogan of putting user in control of the information is just as dominant as it was in the Google discourse. However, once I looked into the scarce technological information, namely patents available about HoloLens, I could see that it's not just equipped with actually the same amount of cameras, and even more than in the case of Google Glass, with the same functionality and the same capabilities. They also have the possibilities of mapping the environment, gesture, and gaze tracking of public to be able to interact and move with the holograms in a precise way, just like one of the Microsoft gaming consoles had Kinect, which also raised a lot of public concern. But whereas Google Glass was used and we know the existing concerns, it was interesting to see how people interacted or kind of cherished their promises and how they would like to interact with this technology online. And the two videos that I looked at online, where the one of the very bright examples of the glass hole etiquette online, which was promoted by Mashable, a tech company in the United States, which gave kind of a scenario overlook how not to be a glass hole, which sprung a lot of reactions and comments from the YouTube users. And the second one was a presentation, the latest presentation of Microsoft by the capabilities of this technology of HoloLens during the Microsoft Build conference in late May in 2015. Where we see, for instance, I don't know if you can see really well, but so it is positioned only as like as an inside technology. So this is a person sitting at home, and there's scarce in interior design. There are no wallpapers, nothing like that. But instead, there are holograms, primarily for whatever purpose you want them to use. There's also the assistant. I don't know. It's kind of like a little robot, but it's someone sort of like a virtual friend who you interact with. They talk to each other. You can run around it, walk with this. It was pretty impressive on the presentation itself, and also like really customize your personal space at will, and it's really just yours. It's your private space. And I was curious to see how the users perceived it and how people really looked at it and shared their experiences. And what I came up with is that privacy as control of information was actually just rarely the dominant discourse. It was actually how to deal with the new kind of technological options and the new social scenarios that they create. They don't necessarily fit this control of information discourse. It was actually a lot of other values that were implicated in those practices, and it had to do, for instance, in the case of Google Glass, as like privacy, not just of public spaces, but privacy of communication. How does our interaction change with each other when you don't know when someone is being filmed or treated in a different manner than stated originally? Privacy of personhood, how would you express yourself in public? And for instance, privacy of identity building. In a sense of HoloLens, it was interesting that a much more intimate understanding of privacy was taken. For instance, privacy as selective access to the self at home, or intimacy via virtual companionship and such. This does not pretend to be a new categorization of privacy, but rather an explorative way to see how did people actually try to grasp those situations and come up with the meaningful ways to relate to them in the face of these technologies. So just briefly recapping the findings, what I wanted to see is how are there any specific situations and how are people responding in this socio-material context? And there indeed different multiple understandings of privacy emerged, whereas HoloLens organizes a more intimate virtual space than the physical world around you. They allow you not just to do that, but to customize it at will without any cost or large effort, so to speak. And Google Glass, it actually extends the private sphere much further into the public realm and introduces a possibility of this constant surveillance practice without any scope, reasonable scope, or discrimination practices, or how to deal with them. How is it being contextualized and interpreted later? And the main trends were that the researchers, the users explored the concept of privacy in the case of Glass as a much more connected to surveillance practices and distrust in Google as a company and their practices of dealing with personal data, whereas in the case of HoloLens, a much more intimate and local privacy at home, privacy via interaction with individuals. And I think it's really necessary to understand that in order to know how to use this technology in an informed way, because privacy is not just control of information, but we're aware of that, but also for a user to understand which new options come up and how to deal with them. So basically, that was it. And concluding, I just want to say that, yeah, privacy is not just one, but it's rather a rich body multiple. And the value of privacy springs from particular socio-material practices that technologies enable around us. And I believe that to develop meaningful relationships with these technologies around and to understand what's at stake, it's necessary to see how they mediate our life. And I just tried to explore how I can use technological mediation theory to explore that possibility. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Olga. The presentation was kind of quite rich in sort of methodology, theme, novel themes, and also conceptually. So there's much to talk about, I guess. But over to you, Gemma.
Yeah, much to talk about, and just as a note, because Aimee had to be replaced, I just heard what Olga had to say, so I'm going to be improvising, which can be good or bad, but just for you to know, and I'm hoping that in the debate we can maybe enrich my my comments. But so bringing it to my field, which is very, I guess, very particular in the context of this table, when I'm trying to reconcile the philosophical or more social science academic understandings of the impact of technology with the needs of corporations that want to develop products. I think that starting with Google Glass is a really great thing to do, because there's nothing that conveys more the role that a social scientist or a philosopher or anyone coming from academia, there's nothing that puts on the table the need of such profiles more than privacy failures. And I think that Google Glass is a clear example of a privacy failure, a product that was supposed to be successful and did not succeed for reasons that Google probably doesn't really understand yet. So the question for me is, could our involvement in the process of developing Google Glass could it have helped Google understand that this product would not be as successful as they hoped? What role do we have to play? And we've seen lots of privacy failures in the last few months and years. We're not that much aware of them because with privacy failures, they tend to be like hidden and like just remember the successes. Like no one remembers about Google Glass anymore. And 2 years ago, no one would have questioned that was going to be the future. And now we're like, that didn't really exist. Now let's focus on Google cars and all these things that will be successful, or on the watches or the wearables. Just make sure you don't lose your faith in technologies being successful. But the truth is, there's lots of technologies that fail. And they fail because people don't accept them. And I think that this realization by some of the stakeholders involved in making technology policy has gotten them to realize that that something needs to be done, and so that ethics can play a role. And I use ethics in a very broad definition. I am not an ethicist. I don't have an ethical background, but I've kind of hijacked or seized the opportunity opened by the realization that there are technology failures and privacy failures that could have been foreseen or mitigated if other people had been on the table when those technologies were designed. And I think that's the message we're trying to get across, and that's what we're trying to get the technology developers and policymakers to realize. It wouldn't have been that hard to foresee that Google Glass was going to run into problems. It wouldn't have been that hard to realize that smart meters were going to run into problems, or the spy bins that had to be removed in London and New York, or the full body scanners that never made it, were never something that was adopted by all airports in the world. So there's lots of technologies that have stopped at the very beginning because people just did not accept them, which kind of points to a thing that I feel opens the debate, which is it's not only about ethics. It's not only about the law. The reason why a technology fails can be very varied. It can be lots of different things. So can just an ethicist alone foresee the social impact of that technology? Probably not. Can a lawyer alone foresee whether a technology will thrive? Probably not. So the big question for me, the thing that I would like to address, is how can we make sure that we put the right people on the table? How can we have the lawyers and the ethicists, but also the policy analysts, the sociologists, the anthropologists, the engineers? How can we make sure that we audit the things that we are telling industry to do? So if we learn all these things about why people didn't accept Google Glass, what can we tell the engineers to do? What kind of etiquette of the future can we already build into the technology? And I think these are the questions that we need to be answering at Eticas when we work, because we see the importance of all these things being taken into account. We make sure that we focus on the law, but also on acceptability, on ethics, but also on data management. So you kind of retrace the whole data life cycle and identify the moments of vulnerability. And then on the basis of that, you build better ideas for products. And I think that is the big challenge. How can we make sure that the understanding of Google Glass that we have and of the social impact, the limited social impact that it had, or how can it change relationships around it? How can it change your awareness of yourself and others, your relationship to other people? All these things that we're learning about the social impact of technology, can we build them into a new understanding of how to make technology? And so this idea of technology as a mediator, the limits of the technology in terms of options, privacy by design, privacy enhancing technologies, how can that be the new paradigm for the technological developments of the future? I probably don't have to.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. And just really, we're going to have a broader discussion later on, but has anyone got any questions of clarification at the moment for Olga or Gemma at all? Yep.
What did you call this privacy failure? Why is Google going to a privacy failure or not a privacy success?
Oh, because it didn't become a thriving business model. It didn't respond to the expectations of Google, in a way. So it's when they don't make the money that they expected to make, when it's not the major breakthrough that they expected, then we call that a failure. When there's something that gets in the way of their vision of perfect integration of their technologies with the everyday life of people.
But market failures can be a success for society and for...
Yeah.
Oh, but yes. I mean a privacy failure for the ones that developed it. But I often say that the field of privacy is not moving forward because of debates or because of privacy by design. I think we have privacy by disaster. The more we have privacy disasters, and that's a privacy disaster for Google. It might be good for society, but it's a privacy disaster for Google. So the more we have disasters and technologies that fail and expectations of companies and governments that are not fulfilled, the more the window of opportunity opens for ethicists and social scientists to have a say, because they realize that actually on their own, just the technologists and the business people, they don't really have all the answers. So they might need to talk to other people.
So one very quick question, clarification.
Yeah, a follow-up question actually, because I also was wondering about the term privacy failure, because they are rather maybe business failures. For example, the glass project was also, as I understand it, too expensive to buy it for normal people. And you mentioned body scanners, which are used at some airports, but I also heard that they are too expensive, so that's one of the reasons why there are not that many by now.
But they're expensive because the companies, and we worked with them on that, the companies they never had enough clients to develop them before beyond the pilot phase, when things are a lot more expensive. So for all companies, developing just a pilot is never profitable. Actually, you'll lose a lot of money if you can only develop the pilot. With full body scanners, most companies, and you have different companies competing, but most companies have only been able to develop the pilots because the amount of full body scanners that they sold was not enough to justify a new business line around that. And I would call it privacy disaster because it is a business failure because of privacy. That's why the privacy failure in a way, because it has to be there. Privacy is that important that it can mean that your business strategy fails just because you overlooked that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then moving on to the next section of the panel, then we've got two further speakers. We've got Marjolein Lanzing, who's a PhD candidate at 3TU, Centre for Ethics and Technology, there, which is situated in the School of Innovation Sciences at Eindhoven University of Technology. Her PhD project is entitled The Transparent Self, Identity and Relationships in a Digital Age, and she analyses changing norms around privacy under the perspective of the changing meanings of self in the current digital age. She's also a member of the Amsterdam Platform for Privacy Research. After her paper, we'll have a brief discussion from Dr. David Barnard-Wills, who will be familiar to many people. He's a senior research analyst at Trilateral Research based in the UK. He's conducted lots of research for Trilateral on a range of issues around privacy and security, particularly in respect of certification schemes. He is also a political scientist and has written a very influential and a fantastic book, which I've actually read on surveillance and identity. And he's also held research and academic posts at Cranfield University, the University of Birmingham, and worked for the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. So yeah, over to you, Marjolein.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this panel. My name is Marjolein, as been said. And well, my project has been introduced quickly. I'm working on changing norms of privacy. I'm working on how new ICTs, new information and communication technologies, change our privacy norms and what it actually means for the way we perceive our social relationships, but also the relationships with ourselves. And for today, I want to take you through a recent project that I did, a paper that I just finished, which was about something called self-tracking, which looked like this in the 1980s and looks like this right now. It's a very serene picture right there. This is a Muse headband, and it's actually a form of self-tracking. It's a wearable device, a device that you can actually wear. You can wear it on your head, but there are many forms of self-tracking devices that are intended to quantify aspects of yourself. So for instance, the Muse headband over here measures the electrical pulses in your head. It will signal to you whether you're stressed out and need to take a break or something like that. But there are many other forms of self-tracking devices. You might even know people who wear, for instance, the popular Strava bracelet or the Fitbit bracelet, maybe an Apple Watch or a Google Glass, even an autographer, something, it's a little camera you can hang around your neck. These are all devices intended, most of them are intended really for health purposes, for lifestyle purposes. So they measure, for instance, the amount of steps you've taken, the amount of calories you've taken, your weight. It compares all these things, all this data, and combines the data. And it's a proliferating practice. So the market is really growing. There are many quantrepreneurs, as they call themselves, people who are getting into the quantified self business, developing these new kinds of technologies that will enable you to get a healthier lifestyle or become a healthier person, for instance. I think it's interesting that over the last couple of years we've seen that these devices are becoming increasingly institutionalized. So there are some cooperations going on, for instance, between Fitbit, employers, and health insurances. Now, I think this is a very interesting new technology, emerging technology, and while there's lots of stuff going on in the social sciences and communication sciences and media studies, there is not really an ethical viewpoint yet. Well, there are several people working on that right now, but it's not really developed yet. So I thought a philosophical approach would be something that we should add to the mix. So the ethics question then, I'm sorry, I'm just not, they're not linked. The ethics question then is how we should interpret self-tracking technologies that encourage and facilitate transparency. And I mean with transparency, I mean sort of increasing push to disclose more and more information and disseminate it also to other parties that you might formerly would not have disseminated this information to from a normative perspective. How should we assess this? So for this paper, I focused mainly on self-tracking technologies that were used in the domain of health and lifestyle. There are also self-tracking technologies that will help you to get more productive or more effective, or will measure your moods or your sexual lifestyle. But I focused on the health domain because most investments currently are going on that particular area. And you can also imagine that a lot of parties are interested in the information that it generates, personal health data, which is quite sensitive, of course. So for the paper that I wrote, I focused on a conceptual tension that I think is going on right now in the discourse surrounding these wearables and lots of other technologies really, but you see it a lot within the quantified self movement, within the self-tracking communities. And it's the idea that disclosing personal information increases one's self-control on the one hand, and then there will be the more conservative or maybe the ethicists or the philosophers who say, yeah, well, but one also needs informational privacy in order to be an autonomous person. And these things seem to be in some kind of contradiction. So I thought that's worth looking into, because I think that self-tracking can, in fact, prove an adequate method to shed, for instance, light on certain aspects of the self and maybe improve your self-knowledge and then improve your self-control. But I think that currently the benefits are cancelled out by the fact that they are exposing too much to too great an audience, actually. Okay, so in the paper I discuss actually the practice and promise of the cultural phenomenon of self-tracking. Then I explain why self-tracking devices are not the same as digital diaries or shouldn't be each other's equivalent. Then I discuss the culture of self-tracking and how it fosters decontextualization, so that's information transgressing its original border into different social domains. And then I discuss certain privacy problems by looking into philosophical literature on the relationship between privacy and autonomy. So for the first part, I actually dove into the quantified self movement, the movement that actually believe that self-knowledge grows through numbers. So as long as we can sort of quantify ourselves, then we can increase our self-knowledge. The more aspects of ourselves that we can sort of translate into data, raw data, numbers, facts, that's actually the basis for solid self-knowledge. And this promise, the promise of transparency that the quantified self movement has, but also many self-trackers adhere to, is the idea that the increase of self-knowledge and the increase of self-awareness and self-reflection will be dependent on the way you collect information about yourself and the way you disseminate or share this information. for instance, with others. So transparency will empower you. It will reduce confabulation about your behavior. For instance, you may think that you don't eat chocolate all the time, but then it turns out that your Fitbit shows you, yeah, exactly, well, you've been taking your 3rd bar this week. That's actually quite a lot. It might reduce certain illusions about your behavior, for instance. So it can actually be a very illuminating self-help tool. All right. And this is also the way self-tracking devices are often framed. So I attended a Quantified Self conference, and many people talk about their self-tracking device as a self-help tool, as some kind of digital diary, just a digital way of collecting data, writing down what you did on a daily basis. And they also really saw the benefit of gathering all this information, and they really felt it empowered them. So, for instance, there was a beautiful story of this woman who had Parkinson's disease. And by collecting for years her own personal health information about her disease, in a few years' time, she knew more about herself, her behavior, how her body responded to medicine than her own physician and her own neurologist. And together with them, they devised a new plan. And they said to her, well, apparently you know more about this than we do. We'll give you the space to decide yourself when you want to take your medication and how much of it. We'll think of a minimum and a maximum, but it's up to you. You are the expert right now. And she felt empowered by that. She felt more autonomous. So I thought it was an interesting story. However, this is José van Dijk, a media scholar, and she says, well, cultural practices or forms never simply adapt to new technological conditions, but always inherently change along with the technologies and the potentialities of their use. So it's actually the question whether we should conceive self-tracking devices just as the digital form of a diary, because they do a lot more. And by thinking of them as diaries, as this old cultural form, we generate lots of misconceptions about privacy and about how our information is handled and disseminated. Because QS, Quantified Self, or self-tracking, collects and shares an unprecedented amount of highly intimate details about consumers' bodies and behaviors that historically have been confined to the relatively secure and protected spheres of the home and a professional healthcare organization. This is Heather Patterson. She's a postdoc with Helen Nissenbaum. And she says we have a lot of expectations connected and associated to older cultural forms. And then we may have this new technology. We tend to sort of put them on the new technology, but it's not right, because technologies change the culture, they change the practice. And so contextual expectations and the common informational privacy norms that were connected to the old form do not apply to the new form, and, well, they do not apply in the cloud. And you see a lot, she also, in her research, she shows how people actually, because they think of these self-tracking technologies as medical tools, they associate it with the protective healthcare sphere, the sphere of the home, and they tend to disseminate much more, users tend to disseminate much more information, share much more information than they might want to, if they knew. Okay, so then in the third part, I wanted to see how technology actually shapes these practices of sharing more information and handling information in a new way. So I dove into the culture of self-tracking again. I looked into the community of self-trackers, the discourse that they use, which really stimulates disclosure to unknown parties, the design of the self-tracking devices, which also stimulates the same kind of disclosure, and the enterprises that are behind these devices that actually push a certain way of using the technology, but also cannot anticipate other uses, of course, that are also involved. In the end, I discovered that decontextualization is going on. So with many of these devices, you think you generate very particular healthcare information about a particular aspect of your life or your behavior or yourself. But in the end, this information is spread out to an unknown audience, to unspecified audiences you couldn't have even conceived years ago. So I just want to conclude by right on time. I just wanted to conclude by a final paragraph or final section about more conventional privacy theories. And although I think there's much to gain in that department, I do think that it's interesting to see that we need these dynamic informational privacy boundaries. We need some kind of boundaries in order to protect our autonomy and our autonomous lives. And if our information is disseminated broadly to unknown audiences, we lose a form of autonomy that is much more fundamental than the very immediate sense of control you get from using these self-tracking devices, for instance, for measuring your calories or the steps taken. So yes, I want to conclude now. These are the findings of the paper. So the conclusions were that self-tracking promises to empower by increasing self-control and self-improvement by generating, disclosing, and sharing data. But it actually problematizes on autonomy on a more fundamental level, although it can be successful sometimes. So it encourages to decontextualize information flows and disclosures to unspecified audiences. And it is increasingly institutionalized, and I think that's reason to really think about implementing new boundaries or re-evaluating the way the devices are designed right now and the way the discourse is flowing right now. Because as it is right now, I foresee that we will outsource our self-government to devices and those who actually control and access them by making visible what was not visible before. And that might actually conflict with a sense of autonomy as we may like it. That's it.
Thank you very much, and yeah, another rich conversation, and I learnt a new word, quantrepreneurs, as well. Okay, over to you, David, for discussion.
Cheers. I've got one slide that I'd like to fire up at some point, if you've got it over there. So I've been asked to comment on the contribution that Marjoleine's kind of paper makes, and I can really only do that from like my perspective. And my perspective is a social scientist much more than a philosopher, but my day job most of the time is building research projects. Right? It's putting them together, and many of those will have some kind of legal, ethical, social bit, especially if they're kind of technology development projects. So that's where I'm coming from. So I think I've been invited here because I've tried to get Michael to be on the ethics advisory boards in the past, so I think I should apologise. Yeah, definitely. So what I'd like to do is characterise this approach from that perspective, and then sort of talk a little bit about the contribution it would make to my world. So in her paper, Marjolein engages in several activities. She's asking normative questions, right? She's asking questions about values and norms. In this case, the key value being discussed is autonomy. She's interpreting technologies and their use in the world through a philosophical and ethical lens. To my mind, she's surfacing issues that might otherwise be hidden or overlooked from other perspectives, and those other perspectives might be, technology development as an economic activity, or scientific development of new technologies from a more research perspective. In this case, the thing she's kind of surfacing is this tension between disclosure in the pursuit of individual goals and a larger sense of individual autonomy as mediated by a particular type of technology. And she contributes towards challenging the conventional explanations of self-tracking found amongst the self-tracking community and these kind of advocates of it by doing in the paper what I see as an analytical redescription, right? So it's kind of taking their statements about what they're doing and then kind of looking at it through these lenses and going, seen from this perspective, it looks a little bit different. It's a reconception that references back to those philosophical fundamentals, so autonomy. To my eye, the rhetorical move of the paper is we value autonomy. The current use of quantified self-tracking impacts upon autonomy, hence there is a problem to be resolved. I think the contribution of this type of approach, it's an approach we can see in other areas as well. We can see it in kind of science and technology studies, and we can see it in surveillance studies. So it's, I think there's the lines where ethics and other activities sit is something that we should probably question. But it's raising questions that will have to be approached in more detail, in particular contexts and using particular different tools. That's where I, as a social scientist, come into this. And I'd be like, well, I need to talk to many more users and non-users and things like that. But what it does do is operationalise normative fundamentals. So it takes a concept like autonomy and says, well, in these contexts, in these technologies, and amongst this community, it's playing out in this particular way. And that's really kind of useful. So to use a concrete example, if I can have the first slide up. So,
Oh, yeah.
just
let me see. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a Trilateral, we have a project called Pulse. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is one of the perverse incentives that European research funding gives, in that you try and find every opportunity for a dissemination event. So Pulse is about building technologies that will support emergency response personnel during emergencies. And Trilateral is involved in one of these ethical, legal, social impact assessment pieces of work within this project. So we have to kind of figure out what are the ethical issues raised by some of the key scenarios the project is using, which are like a SARS-like pandemic and a kind of crush in a stadium. But also to look at the project itself and make sure that it's meeting its kind of legal and ethical requirements. So if this was about quantitative self stuff instead of kind of, whatever it is it's actually doing, Marjoleine's work would feed into that in the sense that it would be the starting process, and we definitely use it in this type of kind of ethical impact assessment, but we'd have to take it as the starting point for what questions would we ask of people in particular contexts, right? I think that's kind of what I want to say about that. So part of this is doing kind of literature reviews, and definitely this type of fundamental ethics applied to particular technologies is useful. I think it's really useful. We then take some further steps to operationalise it, and that's something we can talk about a little bit more, but I'll leave the comment there for the time being.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. And to you, Michael.
Okay, so maybe we just take the time for one brief question for clarification, if there is any in the audience, either to David. Yeah, please.
I was wondering what you thought about the relationship between the perception of autonomy and actual autonomy. So somebody might feel very autonomous, and a philosopher would say, no, actually you're not. And what is better? Is it better to feel autonomous and not be, or is it better to be very autonomous and not feel autonomous?
That's a very good question. Well, I'm all in favor of the second, I think. But I think you meant the quote that I gave from the woman with Parkinson's disease who felt empowered, and then I used it as an example because you get it's one of those one of their key examples on those conferences to show how this really helps getting in charge of your life. And so there are a lot of these success stories that people tell about how these self-tracking technologies enable them to really control a certain aspect or a certain part of their life which they were insecure about or anxious about, or so whether they are in fact autonomous. Well, I should really look into that if they are. But she did feel it that way, and she explained it by telling how she did it, and that's a very fundamental part also of these stories that they tell, how they did it, what they exactly did, and how this contributed in their lives. But you can never be exactly sure, of course. But of course, this poses a problem. I take these kinds of notions and I try to look at them through a philosophical lens and see whether that's actually autonomy or not, or what the value is. But that can go wrong, of course. That's also true. I think it was a question.
Yeah.
Actually a question about when you study the quantified self, because now you set it up as a kind of one position, so the self-control within these communities, and then the kind of the ethical assessment that there might be a problem. But what about the assessments that these people within the quantified self movement make themselves of these situations? Because I found, for instance, that there are very interesting models of privacy that they work with, and that they have, because of the expertise they've gained. It's not only maybe in Parkinson, but they also gain expertise in how to actually hardwire these mechanisms of data control within the devices that they use, and they come up with interesting conception of privacy or data protection as they go along. So how would you relate to this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I attended the Quantified Self conference last summer, and I went to the privacy sessions, and they were empty. And then, because I was really interested in their conception of privacy, but I was the only one there, and another academic, and we were like waiting for everyone to talk about privacy, but there was no one there. Except for that, I mean, it could be lots of reasons, maybe a different fun parallel session. But what I noticed in talking to the quantified self people is that, of course, there is a very select group among the quantified self movement, the hardcore self-trackers, who actually managed to create these kinds of technologies that are really privacy-proof. But most of the people there, like just the lay folk using self-tracking technologies because they are just enjoying it, they don't know how to fix that. So you really have to have very serious knowledge of technology to make these kinds of devices. It's a lot of trouble, costs a lot of energy and money, and you have to invest a lot of time in it. It is possible, but only for a very, very, very select group of people. And the rest, I didn't get that sense at all. But there's lots of common people, of course, just using these wristbands, apart from those very serious people, of course. That's.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Michael, you wanted to just ask a brief question of some of the panelists, and then we'll move on to a more general discussion.
I think actually the last question already led us nicely to the kind of short exercise that I would like to pose on Marjolein and Olga. I briefly reflect on how, what kind of differences and similarities there are in your two approaches. So because I felt like when the question came up about how to deal with the privacy concepts that emerge within the field of the practitioners, that sounds more like an Olga question, but I might be wrong about that.
Well, I guess I don't know actually how similar they are, because I think it's a bit different questions that we're asking, but I tried to combine empirical research with philosophical insights, and I tried to kind of have a bottom-up look at what's happening and see whether I can look at it through slightly sociological / philosophical lens. So in the case of this presentation, the mediation approach was something where I could see, okay, so basically what I did is I had to look at what the industry signs, what are the promises, what are the concerns from the public, what is the technological setup, and what is actually happening in practice, and to compare it and to see how it levels up with these initial promises and concerns, and to see what are the values are implicated, and what's the larger picture, what's at stake. So that was the approach of technological mediation. So I guess in this case it was much more user-oriented, but you could also use it for a larger societal impact of more kind of qualitative soft impacts of technology. And in that sense, I think it's more kind of a practice-oriented ethical approach.
Okay, so Marjolein?
I'm not a social scientist. I have a background in philosophy. I do like to do empirical. I don't want to call it research. I do interviews. I do read lots of multidisciplinary literature, and I use that. I'm not going out on my own, making surveys or using programs to analyze discourse. I don't do that. But I do go out into the field just to see what's going on. And I do think that's valuable in a different sense, not necessarily as bona fide empirical research, and I don't present it as such. But I do think the experiments that I do, or the field work that I do by myself, is valuable in the sense it can be an illustration of what's going on within a particular culture or field. And it gives me a good sense of what's going on outside. Because, of course, I could also be behind my computer and take Immanuel Kant and try to apply that to what I find on the internet. But I don't think that's a very useful approach, especially not with an emerging technology and a very popular emerging technology such as this one. After everything is right at your doorstep, you can go outside and meet these people and talk to them and see what's going on. You can meet producers and designers, and so I do that. But it's not as grounded, I think, as, for instance, in the empirical sciences as your work is. So,
but I do have a training in science technology studies, so it gives me a bit of a sociological benefit. So I do also qualitative interviews and the surveys and all. Actually, what I think is appropriate for that context, because you can work with what's there. And this time I tried to work with YouTube comment videos, and it proved to be very interesting, but I don't know if I'm going to employ it for a larger project.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that now opens up a wonderful discussion if we would like to have it. So my general plan for now is we will spend the remaining time discussing things, either amongst the panelists. We have prepared some wonderful questions. We can spend all the remaining time, but we also give the opportunity for the audience to take over, to raise questions. For example, like, wait a minute, isn't an ethicist actually being hired for reading Immanuel Kant rather than going outside and go to quantify self conferences? So, yes, please. Torrin.
So I'm Torrin Monahan from University of North Carolina. question following up on Marjolein's presentation. And you started to trouble the empowerment discourse surrounding quantified self, but I wanted to push you to do that further, especially along lines of gender, and see if you could, think about critical self-body image issues, or even the metaphor of the diary, which I found so provocative because it's this feminized discursive register, but it also is a certain kind of tool of empowerment that's for exploration, self-exploration, or that you want someone to find out so you could get them, to read about themselves. So, where are the moments for empowerment or maybe disempowerment, especially along gender lines, that with these technologies?
I think that's a very interesting question. I'm really interested also, I'd love to go a little bit deeper in the direction of gender aspects of self-tracking as well, and surveillance. However, I haven't done much work on that. I did notice that, for instance, on the quantified self-conference, the largest part of its membership is male, white, Western. There were very few women very few women presenting, and when they were presenting, it was about completely different topics than the men. Men were generally talking about health and athletic performances and combining these kinds of things, and then women were usually presenting on their periods, their hair growth. So, I mean, these are topics that are in a sense taboo, and these tools do give them some kind of way of expressing themselves, measuring these aspects of their life that are maybe generally hidden from other people. And here they were completely accepted, and people were interested, asking questions. How did they do it? How does it work? What did you find out? And so, in a sense that, it's interesting that there's so little women involved yet, or at least present there. But maybe I'm not sure whether that's actually a good representation of, for instance, the self-trackers generally, because if you go on the web, you find lots of female self-trackers, and they measure everything, and they expose a lot of things about themselves and their lives. But you can also wonder whether that's actually empowerment, but that's a problem that you have to dig deeper into, I think. But it also has to do with the whole conceptualization of privacy in public and what you should reveal as, for instance, a woman or not. And
Can I say something about that, Michael? Yeah, just one of the things that we keep stumbling upon are the difficulties of researching the relationship between technology and society. I think that when we're looking at relationships between people and technological objects, there's so many things that come up that would not come up in other kinds of research. And so I think we have lots of challenges, and it's a challenge for technological companies to take us into account. But we also have a challenge with ourselves, which is to step it up and improve the ways of inquiry, improve the ways in which we ask society how they feel about technology. Because we keep coming across the gender bias all the time, like all the surveys and any other like sociological method, like traditional sociological method that we use. First, the male thing, like men would always tell you that they know what you're talking about when you're talking about technology, because men know about technology, and so that's their assumption of themselves. And so you need to always take that into account when you understand it, when you try to read the results. But it's not just that. We keep doing large surveys at the EU level, massively expensive, and the results say nothing about our society. Like if you take the results of the surveys and then look at our society, they're contradictory. It's like you took a survey on Mars. So we have people saying it is unacceptable to accept money as a trade-off for your privacy. These are the same people who give away their privacy for free all the time. But when you ask them that question, they get on their ethical high horse being like, oh, that's so unacceptable. So it doesn't match with reality. And so we need to improve the way in which we study the society around us. So we're trying to experiment with experiments, quasi-experiments, role-playing, because there's so many things. It's so sociologically loaded, this interaction between technology and society. And the tools that we are using, mainly surveys and just large-scale ways of asking people things in a void about something that they don't understand, but because technology is a black box for most people, those things don't work. And I think that whoever's funding this, and they're funding us, but they should, the funders should stop funding surveys because they just don't work. And so we need to find new ways of asking people about how they feel about technologies that they do not understand. So beginning from that, I'm asking you things about something that you don't understand. And until you understand it, until you have a privacy disaster in your own skin, you will not know what the loss of privacy means. So how can I understand the impact of the loss of privacy on society when people have not experimented that? But I want to be able to forecast what's going to happen in the future. So it's really wicked. It's not an easy problem, but I think we need to face it, and we need to discard traditional methods and be a bit more innovative in how we interact with people when we want to understand what their preferences and reaction to technology might be. I just think that's an important point.
So I see 1, 2, 3. I think you did go first, so please.
I have 2 questions or comments. I'm from a new think tank called Data Ethics. Good to talk. First, did you look at aspects where what is happening to society with these self-tracking devices? Because you probably know of Oscar, the insurance company, which Google invested in, where your premium on your insurance is changing according to how much you're actually moving and living up to your goals, which is really interesting, I think, compared to thinking of the whole solidarity thing you have within insurances. That's one question. And the second question, maybe any of you knows of any self-trackers who are actually privacy by design, or where you actually have control of your data? Because I had a Fitbit, but I had to fake everything on it because I don't want to give my true data to Fitbit. But I would give it to somebody who actually really didn't sell my data to anybody.
So can I come on? I can't talk about privacy by design in quantified self, but I have seen it in smart homes, which have a similar kind of, but actually what happened in there was the earlier, older automated houses were all very self-contained. You built a server in your house and you kind of did it. And as it became a kind of more commercialized model, it got put on cloud servers, and it was all gadgets that reported back to Nest or whoever. And actually that's a shift in the industry. So the smart gadgets that you can get now are not the only options in the marketplace. But the older versions have been crowded out. And was that Kevin Warwick, the picture of the guy in the 80s, 90s?
Oh no, it's Steve Mann.
Sorry, yeah. He built all that himself, and I'm sure he had rigorous control over where that data was flowing. And as that moves out into a kind of commercial marketplace, a conscious decision has been made not to follow that model.
Yes, please. Sorry, please follow up with the discussion afterwards, but I would like to give room to other.
Yes, I'm a professor of economics. I'm not going to phrase this well probably, but I know a lot of these tracking devices have a sharing feature where you can compare your results to other people, or friends or a group, and also you can contribute to medical databases. How does that fit into your attention about privacy or self-something versus autonomy?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, this falls under the part design. This was a very short summary, but I, of course, looked into those kinds of features of the self-tracking devices. And one interesting thing about lots of these devices is that they're now connected or can all be sort of embedded in Apple Health, for instance, and Apple Health Vault. And much of this information can be shared with research institutions, it can be shared with medical institutions. There's a whole range of institutions where data can be shared with. You can share the data with your friends, with people you don't know who are just in the same age category or weight class, or you can base your the way you want to be measured against other people on certain categories. You can share your information with virtually anyone, and it involves granular control if you really want to protect that information. So you have to adjust your settings. Usually the setting is public by default instead of private by default. Sometimes you have to pay for your privacy, depends on what kind of device you're using or what kind of app you're using. But a lot of it is also automatically just uploaded to different institutions. And I think that does have something to do with the way your autonomy is compromised, because you might not even be aware of the fact that your information is in the hands of other people. But to explain that into depth, we'll have to talk later, because that's I also discussed that in the paper, but it's a bit too long to discuss now. Sorry.
And there's a coffee break and somewhere else you can
Okay.
discuss.
That's good.
So please.
Okay, an impression that the notion autonomy used mostly in terms of self-control. Also, if I read the digital diary thing, then the misconceptions
Yes.
come out. But you could also understand it as a sort of a tool for identity construction, and then you
Exactly.
have a lot to do of how you expose yourself.
Yes.
Have to look at those, because that makes a difference in the practices and also in the mediation question.
Yes. Well, actually, I think those things are related. So the self-control or control of your information, to me, is important for being able to present yourself in a certain way and construct a certain identity. So the way I'm, like you have you need certain privacy boundaries and certain privacy norms in order to, have different kinds of meaningful social relationships and also a certain relationship with yourself. And so I think that if you don't have that type of privacy or informational privacy control, although that's not strictly individual or something, I think it's a social dynamic, but you need it in order to be able to autonomously build on that particular type of identity that you want to maybe construct, or maybe it's not completely deliberate, but you want to have the chance to develop it. Yes, but I do, so I think those things are related.
And if I may briefly follow up on this, so in line with what you suggested, that is also something that is almost automatically stems from mediation theory, because in mediation theory you have to realize that you are not existing independently of technologies. You are not an independent user taking decisions, regardless of what kind of technology it is, but you are partly shaped and constituted by the technology. And then, indeed, it makes much more sense to think about autonomy as a way of identifying yourself, as rather than being this free-floating entity that is in total control of whatever he or she is doing. Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience at this point? If that is not the case, I would actually...
Yeah, there was one.
Sorry. Oh, please.
So I was wondering about what you thought about the relationship between ethics and social norms. I completely agree with you that we need to have better tools of knowing what people think. But suppose you ask people and they're thoroughly knowledgeable about what you're asking, and it's a well-constructed survey about something, and they say it's perfectly acceptable to do X, whatever X is. And then you consult with different experts, from engineers to policy analysts and to ethicists who all say that it's a bad idea. So who wins if you're the consultant and you want to advise someone? Who wins, the society or the experts?
Well, luckily that never happens, because that'd be a problem. But I think there's a very interesting concept that we should never forget, is that specifically for privacy is not an individual thing. When you give up your privacy, you're not only giving up your own privacy. So individual positionings have the value that they have. But should we allow someone to drive their car at 500 miles per hour because they don't believe in driving norms? No, we shouldn't, because that can have an impact on other people. And I tend to think the same way about privacy and the fundamental rights and values that are involved when we discuss privacy. And so the individual point of view for me, when I assess different points of view, has less value than other points of view that are looking at the issue from a more not only general perspective, but also like far-fetched.
And then there's a little break.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, but as I said, luckily that never happens. There are usually people in the public that understand the problems, and you also have experts who minimize the problems. So it's usually you're somewhere in between, jiggling with these different stakeholders.
Maybe also follow up and as a way to lead to a conclusion of this panel. So my take based for that question, how social norms relate to ethical reflection, would go back to Gernot Böhme's work, a German philosopher, who suggested that ethical issues only emerge if we don't know no longer what to do. So as long as there are social norms, we just do what we commonly do. That's fine. But when a new technology enters or new questions are being asked, we don't no longer how to act. And then the discussion starts about how should we act, and ethics might play a part in it by reflecting on what is going on. Which now brings me to my concluding question to the panel. I don't know if we have the time for everybody to reply to it. But so what I got, especially from the comments from David and Gemma, is that ethics can bring in a certain perspective and can be helpful in order to see potential issues and conflicts before they actually happen. So that suggests a little bit of ethics as an early warning system, so to speak. And David pointed out that if he looks at the role that ethics as an academic discipline actually plays in, let's say, funded projects, it's always at the beginning, but not later on. So, so my question here is it really true that ethicists should play the role of a naysayer to say, it's not a good idea according to our technology, so let's not do it? Or should we allow privacy failures or privacy by disaster in order to enable a learning process both for society as well for the actors?
So you've got a kind of political positioning there of how to encourage best practices in privacy, and do you do that by engaging in projects, or do that by undermining projects? And I think the latter is super unpredictable in terms of when it would happen and what it works on. I think there's more room for ethicists to help build better things, right? So not the naysayer, but the so I think particularly on the quantified self stuff, how do we make quantified self technologies that meet the goals, the self-stated, let's take them as authentic goals of people using it, and how do we allow them to do that in a privacy protective way? And then if they don't care about privacy, it's fine, it doesn't matter, but we've built those protections in. And I think so not just privacy, but other ethical issues as well. How do we kind of get ethicists to integrate with social scientists, integrate with designers, integrate with technologists to build better things that meet more ethical goals, rather than just kind of saying because you can do some foresight stuff at the beginning of projects, but you can't sort of pull the plug on them, but because you just won't be invited back.
Right. So now at this point I'm very sorry, but I feel it's a strong moral obligation to end on time in order to give the other panel room to set up the presentation. So I thank you very much for being on the panel. I especially thank the two people who stepped up in rather short time to take over for those who had been ill. I thank you very much for being here. I hope you got a little bit of insight what is going on, especially in ethics in the Netherlands, which is a little bit of an empirically oriented scene. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.